Hello, and welcome to Movies We Dig, the podcast about film, antiquity, and everything in between. I'm Colin McCormick.
I'm Elijah Fleming.
And I'm Christy Vogler.
And today we are unearthing Fall of the Roman Empire, a 1964 American historical epic film directed by Anthony Mann, produced by Samuel Bronston, and starring Sophia Loren, Stephen Boyd, and Alec Guinness. And also joining us today are two very special guests, hosts and creators of The Partial Historians, Doctors Fiona Radford and Peter Green. Fiona, Peta, welcome to the show. We're glad to have you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
It is an absolute pleasure to be here.
I think you're our first international guest for the most part, too, with the exception of Liv Albert from Canada. But
which
we know as well.
Pretty cool. yeah, we were on a 18-hour time difference or something like that.
That's crazy. How's the future?
The future is amazing and very warm today as it happens. Completely different hemisphere, completely different time zone.
So, we usually like to start with our guests. I'm a little thrown off because it's Saturday night and we usually don't do these on Saturday night. So, I almost forgot we were doing this. And I was like, oh, shit, better, put on clothes. But we usually start with our guests and just sort of general experiences and, thoughts. So, opening question, Fiona and Peta, do you dig this movie?
I do. I do have some reservations, but I do like it. But then I tend to like most movies that I see. My bar is very low.
I'm going to say that I do dig this film. I do not necessarily want to watch it again anytime soon, though. That's my caveat.
How many times have you seen it all said and done?
Once.
I have seen it probably 6 times, but that's over the course of my entire life. In recent times, definitely once in the past 5 years, let's say.
Yeah, this was my first viewing. I don't know about Eli and Christy, because we did a slew of these kind of golden age sword and sandals maybe a year and a half ago, and then we decided to take a break because after the third or fourth 4-hour epic with an intro, outro, intermission, we were kind of like, can't do it anymore.
And this reminded me why we stopped.
Yeah.
I have to say, I don't think I dig this movie. I think the action was all in the wrong spots for me. And I love Alec Guinness, and I wish he was in more of the movie or doing more things, I guess. I think maybe the highlight, though, was Christopher Plummer just being so weird and a creepy emperor in kind of a different way, which I'm sure we'll come back to. So
I feel like that's usually the case, right? It's usually the wicked emperors have the most fun within these parts, like Peter Ustinov as Nero or Joaquin Phoenix or something like that. We'll come back to that. Whereas the leads are kind of vanilla, and I think this one especially.
Oh, yeah.
What about you, Christy?
I'm kind of surprised I hadn't seen this one before because as an undergrad, I took a sword and sandal film class, which I really enjoyed. So saw Cleopatra and everything. And I'm amazed this one missed the radar somehow. But it makes sense because when I read the synopsis, I'm like, this is Gladiator. But how have I never heard of this?
I feel like this movie is remembered chiefly for two things. One being kind of the last 50s, 60s golden age sword and sandal and maybe killing the genre, which we can talk about. And two, basically being the inspiration for the much more famous and successful Gladiator. But I don't know. Where do we want to start? Do we jump right ahead to Gladiator, or should we dive into this?
Oh, look, let's spend some time with this film because I think as you say, Christy, not knowing that connection is common, I think. And certainly I didn't know about that connection until I watched this film. And I was like, hey, wait a minute. This is where a whole bunch of ideas about Marcus Aurelius get laid out incorrectly in the cinematic universe to then be perpetuated later on. So it's I think sitting with this film for a while is good because it starts to reveal the hints of what is to come with something like Gladiator.
Very cool. Yeah, so let's talk about Marcus Aurelius then, because I think that's one of the the 5 good emperors that he's always sort of termed. And I feel like people have a real love for Marcus Aurelius outside of just a history class. People read the Meditations, and the Stoic philosopher emperor is a vibe. And I'm interested to see, I can kind of see where you're going with maybe that some things that we think about him come from this portrayal.
Yeah, definitely.
Illuminate some things for me.
Just explain Marcus Aurelius.
Explain Marcus Aurelius from the beginning.
To put it concisely, so he's the last of those who are considered the good emperors. He's the last of the 5. And there's an open question about why he didn't decide to adopt the next emperor and thus set up a continuation of goodness, because that might have been a good idea. But for all of his philosophical smarts, he decides to leave it to his son, even though he's on the record with saying, I don't know if Commodus is up for this, but I've got to go back to the Danube and fight the Germans. I'm quite busy. So that's a whole thing. But part of what I really enjoyed about this film was there was this really poignant moment where Marcus Aurelius is talking to his daughter, Lucilla, and this is Sophia Loren, and he's saying to her, like, I really want you to be able to marry for love. That's kind of my dream for you. And I was like, oh, that's cool. Surely Marcus Aurelius has something to tell us about love from a philosophical perspective. And then I got waylaid by his love letters with Fronto. And I was like, oh, wait a minute. So forget the meditations. It's like he has this hugely passionate, intellectual, maybe physical love affair with his tutor when he's about 18. And he does experience great love in his life. And he ends up being married to Faustina later on, and they produce many, many children. And you think to yourself, okay, there's this moment where we know the Romans don't really do marriage for love. That's not at all what Romans are about, and particularly the very elite. It's very political. It's about setting things up. The historical record for Lucilla's life contradicts almost everything in this film. And yet we have this moment where Marcus Aurelius is sort of touching on love as part of the discourse. And I was like, this is kind of the US and the modern sort of focus on like thinking about what is the possibilities of love, what does the new world look like post-war, and then you've got what we do know now more about Marcus Aurelius and his own sort of intimate life, which I think is really beautiful. And I was really excited by that connection. So I admit I got quite distracted in my research.
But on the other hand, Alec Guinness is a dead ringer for Marcus Aurelius' statues.
It was an excellent casting choice. Yeah,
it was great. It was great, and I love his speech patterns and it just the way that he's like waving. And I feel like so many of those scenes actually look a lot like. This is like jumping back, but like the vistas on Trajan's column, which are all on the Danube, so different emperor. But that just like that waving, that really got me. I thought that was cool.
I think you're on the right track there because they actually really tried to make this film accurate in spite of what Dr. G has just said. They tried hard to make this film accurate, and they were drawing a lot from things like Trajan's column and actual archaeological remains to try and craft the sets for this film and the atmosphere.
I was wondering on that myself, and just when they have, I think, the first scene where they go into Rome and they go through the Forum, and then I literally was just in Rome for a conference like 2 weeks ago and visited the Forum, and I was trying to like pinpoint and reconcile all of the sites, and I'm like, well, with the one big exception that everything in the movie is stark white, gleaming marble and unpainted. But I'm also not a material cultural specialist, so I will defer. But things seem to be kind of in the right spot, but I don't really know.
Yeah, look, I don't think they got it obviously like 100% correct, but they did try really hard to construct this set. I mean, this is back in the day, obviously, when they actually had to build these things. So I'm always just like, you know what? A for effort, guys. You can't rely on computers.
There was a deliberate choice by the production team where they were considering filming it in Rome and probably in Cinecittà, but then they moved it over, and so pretty much all the movie was filmed in Spain. I think like Rome itself was built kind of outside Madrid, I think, and then the Germany part was like in I think the Pyrenees or something like that.
Yeah, they did a lot of the internal scenes for Rome at Cinecittà, so they did get there. But yeah, those exterior sets, it's a bit tricky because even from like an archaeological perspective, our understanding of the layers is all kind of mixed up. Like we've got a Severan layer and we've got a Nero layer, and we know some Flavian stuff because it's still there. There's some things where it's like it'd be easy to pinpoint and be like, all right, well, we got the foundations for that one. We could stick a thing there. But other stuff, like, approximates are probably good when it comes to film, like the temple to Jupiter on the top of a hill. And you're like, okay, that's good. Nice work, guys.
Mhm. Yeah, I think they had a little Vestal Virgin looking temple at one point they walked past.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Opening up dangerous territory for me there.
Don't let us stop you. I mean, we got all
Yeah.
night.
Well, oh goodness. So, like the Vestal Virgin, there's a couple of angles on that. Like, there's obviously the archaeological aspect of it, and you're like, ooh, a circular building, that's good news. But you do have this amazing kind of sequence early in the film where Lucilla is talking about maybe she'll enter the Vestal Virgin priesthood.
I knew you were going to pick up on that.
My ears prick up. And I was like, oh, that's fascinating. She's way too old. And I was like, they're not going to let her in. It's a nice try, but you don't get to just retire as sort of like an elderly spinster being like, I didn't make it, guys. I just need somewhere to live out my
like
days.
A nunnery thing. Like,
Yes,
I'm just going to withdraw from the world into a religious cult.
It feels very much like a shorthand for the audience, or like we're just going to substitute going to a nunnery.
And also trying to explain the way that Sophia Loren, as gorgeous as she is, has somehow remained unmarried up until the age of like 29. And you're like, goodness me. And you're like, you're telling me this lady's still on the market? She's a looker and she doesn't seem dumb. I mean, she's got her choices.
It's also like, that's kind of the one thing about the movie itself is like they tried to hint at a changing of time, but like they never like, you can't visually do that with your actors and actresses at the time. So it's like, I don't know, maybe just as actors in their late 20s, early 30s play high schoolers today, maybe they're like, yeah, she's this young, and then now she's 29 and she got married to an Armenian king, so it's fine.
Oh, good. Cementing the deal. Yeah.
Yeah.
To come back to Eli's kind of initial question before we can get into Lucilla, because I want to talk a lot about Lucilla, but Marcus Aurelius, and like kind of his legacy, right? Because Eli kind of hints like he has a moment, he's having a moment now in like popular culture, and in like some ways the very sort of wrong ways where he gets held up as this like uber bro philosopher, logic, reason man that a lot of young men in sort of certain circles and in corners of the internet really uphold as this kind of paragon of like rationalism. And yeah, that does seem to kind of start here. And also he read to me, maybe this is me, he read to me as almost a little like JFK-esque, because like his kind of pitch while he's got all of the nations assembled is one of sort of multiculturalism or globalism or something like that. Like his argument is incorporation into the Roman apparatus, whereas Commodus' whole thing is no, they must pay tribute to us in a very top-down sort of hierarchical structure. So I want to know what did you all think of that?
Before we answer that question, can I say the one moment that made me laugh out loud, because it was kind of like American history in a nutshell, was the introduction of each of the nation's leaders. And the chariot from Africa pulls up and he's just like, Africa, and continues. And I'm like,
It's like this.
Are you Florida all of a sudden just erasing all of any kind of history that way?
It wasn't Egypt. It wasn't like Ethiopia. It was just Africa.
Everybody else who got introduced had a name. And it was this moment where I was like, how do you explain doing this in this film? And I wonder if they thought they were already doing something quite progressive by having a Black actor in the role.
I think there's very little doubt that for all the tone deafness of that moment, that this film was definitely influenced, I think, by the civil rights movement that was happening at the time, especially because Anthony Mann is on the record as saying that whilst he obviously knew he was making a historical epic and he therefore wanted to do his research and make sure the people he was working with did their research and that sort of thing, he also wanted a movie that very much spoke to the present. So he was very much into that idea of, yes, this is a film about the past, but the past can speak to the present.
And I think that ties really well in what you were saying, Colin, about like a JFK-esque character who's maybe like taken out of the game, right? And other people have to swarm in on this sort of edge of maybe there's a big change coming and maybe we're seeing actual growth. and then the retraction and the fear that can cause.
And even just the question of like, probably the forefront of everybody's mind is that the United States is at the forefront of geopolitics and the global world, like what's our role going to be? And then the other central question of this movie is how does an empire end, right? Like, and then sort of there's a very not sort of subtle one-to-one being drawn right here between sort of American prospects and Roman history.
Yeah, that's often a thing, I think, in these films about empire. When they're made by Hollywood, there is the question of the American empire, that it's different to the European one, but it's still a concern, and they do still stop and wonder, are we becoming Rome? Do we have to worry about something? But I think also, I think Anthony Mann and Samuel Bronston, the producer and director of this film, also were actually a bit swept up in the whole Marcus Aurelius vibes. So Samuel Bronston, again, is on the record as saying that of all the films that he produced, Marcus Aurelius is the one that he identifies with the most because of his belief in brotherhood and world peace. And I know that makes Samuel Bronston sound like a Miss America pageant winner, but that is what he found appealing about him. So
Right, yeah. Yeah, this idea of a worldwide community, right? That's the city of the world that we're all, partaking in, which there's stuff in Stoic philosophy about, but.
So as I was watching this, I taught Roman Civ last semester. And I think one of the questions that was always interesting, that like Rome was constantly expanding. It's kind of like a shark that's going to die if it stops swimming. It just kind of needs to keep doing that. And what would often get political leaders in trouble is those instances where they actually want to give Roman citizenship to the people they've conquered. And that idea that Marcus Aurelius was putting out there, that you kept getting this pushback on, was like, make them Romans. And that's not something like a leader just throws out there. They mostly do that for their own veterans, their own soldiers, not for the people they conquer. So I'm kind of interested as like, is that something Marcus Aurelius as a philosopher was actually calling for, or?
It is actually drawing on a historical event from Marcus Aurelius's reign. I believe he did settle a bunch of Germans within Roman borders. The way that it's different, I think, to the film is that there wasn't pushback from the Senate about settling the Germans inside of the empire that you see in the film. And it's possible that the film was actually kind of drawing on Tacitus's recount of Claudius's speech when he's asking for Germanic peoples to be given citizenship. So it's possible that it's drawing on a much earlier incident. And it also doesn't end the same way that I believe the real historical incident did, which is that the Germans started causing trouble and Marcus Aurelius had to get rid of them or like deal with them. So yeah, it does. You're right in that it's not 100% capturing what was actually happening in Aurelius's reign, but it is drawing on, I think, a real relationship that he had with a particular Germanic people.
And I guess also we haven't mentioned it yet, but the other thing that's looming really large in the background of all of this, the elephant in the room, so to speak, is Edward Gibbon, right? And which was the sort of brainchild. Like, so the story goes that I think it was Anthony Mann was waiting for a cab in London, and he spotted like a sort of concise, summation of Gibbon's, decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And then he read it and was like, we should make a movie about this. And that was sort of the germ of the idea, although the script took forever and the script went through a ton of different drafts and it's not really based on Gibbon, but it's like the germ of the idea is coming from like Gibbon's envisionment of how and why Rome eventually collapsed.
Oh yeah. And I think they're trying to, even though they're not necessarily, the script is not Gibbon come to life, I think they are definitely trying to work in all the different reasons that Gibbon gave for the fall of the Roman Empire, even though we know that this actually isn't the fall of the Roman Empire. It's just the beginning of the fall.
Right. As the sort of the closing narration is, this was the beginning of the fall of the Roman Empire.
Yeah. Well, and the opening was pretty good about that too. It's like, you know what? I can get behind this. It's like, because it's like, there's not a single cause. There's many. And the time it took to fall.
This feels like a graduate exam question that we would get or something like that. That's like, when was when did the decline or the fall start? And,
There's a meme, if you've ever, what is it? It's from Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? And the question is like, when did the Roman Empire fall? And it's got 4 different dates underneath it.
Famously, I mean, for our listeners, it's a long, drawn-out, complex process. It's not a single night of flame and thunder. It's, you know, kind of a long, transformative process.
But that's, I think, why I like this film, even though you feel every minute of this epic ticking by. At the same time, I really can't help but like it because of the ambition of what they were trying to do.
Yeah.
And the fact that they didn't opt for the gladiator-esque ending where the bad guy gets punished, the good guy gets what he wants, kind of. I mean, yeah, it's not ideal. He dies, but still. He gets to be reunited with his family. Lucilla's cool. Her son is safe. You know, you don't get that happy ending with this particular film. It really ends on a down note, which is
it's very pessimistic.
Yeah, and I'm like, you know what? Good for you.
I love the open sense of corruption that's going on towards the end. When you've got like the senator hitting up the army, being like, I'll give you 1 million denarii.
They're just bidding for the throne, basically. Yeah,
and I was like, this is cool. But I also feel like they may have missed a trick with that last scene, actually, because in the beginning, going back to that huge introduction of like, somehow we've gathered every leader of every army of Rome in Germania for some reason. One of the guys is introduced as Pertinax of Britannia, and you're like, oh, Pertinax, he's going to become important later on. But it's not the same actor when you get to the end, and there's the guy in charge of the army in Rome, and people are bidding, and I was like, that needs to be Pertinax, guys.
Yeah,
exactly. Like, what have you done?
Maybe the film was just so long that the original actor died and they had to replace him.
Yeah, like I went back and checked because I was like, surely, and I was like, maybe I can pinpoint it, and I was like, no, these are two different dudes.
Look, I'm not saying they couldn't have done it better, but I do admire the attempt and the fact that for a big Hollywood epic, for there to be like not a really big optimistic payoff, I'm like, wow, okay.
This is, I kind of feel like almost like the genre and the ambition of the film is kind of working on cross purposes in a sense, because Eli and I and Christy have talked about, you know, with this genre, it tends to be the protagonists tend to be men who start out great and then they get everything and it continues to be great. They're now one wife richer, basically, at the end of the movie. It has a very individualistic tones, or they tend to. And I think this movie suffers for it a little bit because one of the main criticisms levied against it is that the lead, Stephen Boyd, is a bit bland. You know, is a bit of a cardboard hero.
That blonde hair. I mean, what more could you want from him?
And I almost didn't recognize him because he's Masala in Ben-Hur, where he is completely
very
bronzed
different.
and dark-haired.
And really good in that movie.
Great in that movie. Exactly.
And I was having Ben-Hur flashbacks because when they had when Commodus and the chariot race, which felt like there was probably some producer note where it's like, you have a Roman film, it's got to have a chariot race. Ben-Hur did it. Look how that turned out. But when Commodus and Livius are like first hanging out and they're drinking wine and broing it up, it was very reminiscent of Charlton Heston and Stephen Boyd, with like also very like homoerotic undertones of this friendship.
That's the scene that made me laugh out loud. I'm like, oh my God. Like the way that they fall on top of each other, I'm like, you may as well have actually just had sex, guys. Like,
I definitely like that pairing better than the later gladiator Commodus going after his sister. Cause I'm like, I am not comfortable with that. This I'm comfortable with. Let's keep that going.
I mean, it's also, it's totally fine, obviously, but it's just funny that it is this kind of ongoing thing throughout the movies of this time. And when you've got Stephen Boyd having that kind of chemistry with Charlton Heston, and, you know, the famous thing, obviously, that, you know, Gore Vidal told him to like play it like they were lovers and they were breaking up, and Charlton Heston flatly disputing that ever happened. It just, you can't help but think about those sorts of things.
Yes.
I was going to say, I was expecting an even more tragic ending when Lucilla is walking through the crowd and you see the Greek theater mask all of a sudden. It was like, and then she's chained up And then
more tragic than all the Germans being burnt to death.
I was gonna say, yeah, that was rough.
No, I wanted her and Livius to burn with them and just like make it truly tragic.
Yeah.
Like the fact that he saved her and walked away from her, it's like you couldn't fully dedicate to the tragedy that is happening here.
I would argue that it is more tragic that they lived and have to survive with like their entire faith in Rome being completely trashed.
Yeah, he doesn't seem too broken up about, even though he is directly responsible for the horrible deaths of all these people. He seems kind of like on to the next thing.
Which goes back, I'm going to draw so many connections to Gladiator. I'm sorry, it's just how it's going to happen. But like the reluctance of the protagonist in both of those films to actually take on the task of saving Rome, so to speak. I feel like that messaging is so interesting because it makes it seem as if like a single individual has the power to make or break Rome.
I think it's one of those things where it's like it's really important for the individual characterization so you can get behind them. And it's like the more they refuse it, the more they get to have that reputation as being the right person to do it, precisely because they're unambitious for it. So I feel like that's a trope that they're really building up here as well. It's like, you know, Gaius Livius immediately hands it over to Commodus at the funeral scene. And that would be the moment to take it. Like, that's your best shot. And it's like, there'd be enough people behind you at that point to be able to seal the deal, and you could have Commodus killed like right there and then as needed. So the fact that he chooses not to do that, and you're like, it's the morally correct decision on some level for him to give it to Commodus, and that sets him up as the hero.
It's a total Cincinnatus thing. In a way, that's the thing. Like I understand that narratively it's problematic. And obviously, I mean, I would suggest that it's got something to do with the fact that if you have these individuals acting in this way, it suggests that the person is the problem, not the larger system. But I agree that doesn't gel with what this film is trying to say, which I think is trying to suggest that it is a systematic problem.
Yeah.
But putting that aside, it is actually really Roman to have the guy who should be restoring Rome being the one who doesn't want to do it. That's exactly what I mean. Yeah, we're in like the early Republic mythic sort of period of our podcast, and it seems like almost without fail, at least once every 5 episodes, there is a man who is called on to do a task for Rome, and he does not want to do it, but he does do it because he knows it's the right thing to do by the state. And everybody loves him just a little bit more because he does then give up the power that he had to assume to fulfill the task. It just seems like that is the kind of man that the Romans are in love with. Always, forever, full stop.
But it's a problem when you get to the Empire because the structure of Rome has changed.
Yeah.
And you can't not have one person at the top. So you can't just come into the role, fix the system and be like, all right, retiring now, out of here, leave it to somebody. You look after it, guys, without me. It's not going to work. And so you need to find the right character in the role. Otherwise, the whole thing is starting to sort of fester. And you can see that with Commodus. I mean, he always cops a bad rap in history,
I think
in film.
I'm just going to say that.
Didn't say he didn't deserve
Let's not feel sorry for him.
Not a great guy. But, the way that Christopher Plummer portrays Commodus, I think there's a little bit of hilarity to that performance as well. Like, if we're comparing it to Gladiator, and I know it's impossible not to, like what Joaquin Phoenix does with that role makes it real. You know, there's a sense of a believable plausibility to the way that Commodus behaves and acts and the sorts of motivations that are driving him to be the way that he is. And what we see in this film, I think, is a more sort of an attempt to kind of put a face on a type of evil that it still feels like the big bad guy that maybe it doesn't make sense for why he's behaving this way. Like, he has gotten everything that he's wanted. I mean,
And there's one part kind of towards the very end of the movie that had me scratching my head a little bit, where it's revealed that Commodus is actually not Marcus Aurelius' son. He's the son of a gladiator, which correct me, like there was some rumor of that, like there was a thing that maybe was floating around.
I believe Marcus Aurelius' wife was unfaithful to him. I think that's recorded in the sources. So
yeah, the stories for Faustina are not. She's not necessarily a loyal wife, but she is a very productive mother.
But it seemed to me, again, also to kind of like undermine its own themes a little bit, because it sort of seems to imply that the reason Commodus sucks so much is because he's like of inferior breeding or something like that. Like it's because he's not, if he were actually the true son of Marcus Aurelius, like Sophia Loren, he would be smart or not corrupt or something like that. Which again is, it's sort of, it seems that somewhat at odds with the other message, which is like we should let everybody into Rome.
I feel like it's trying to explain his particular fascination with gladiators, which is true.
Yeah.
He did have that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree. It does seem to be suggesting that if only you were actually his son, then you'd be naturally noble and wise like Lucilla.
Yeah. I do like to often tell my students that Commodus is our first cosplayer.
Okay, that was literally in my mind the whole time watching this film. It's like, this is just a bunch of men who want to cosplay as Romans. Like, all of the big shots with the horses and armies. I'm like, I know what this is about.
It's the people that get into like historical reenactments, or you know, it's just a.
Well, in Britain, because they hold they actually hold gladiator fights and everything in Britain, and it's like, you guys were like literally rebelling against the Romans for like most of your existence. So
it's a complex relationship, but I do like the way that they subtly position Lucilla as a potential leader for Rome, and because this is, I feel like, for the time and for Rome and historically in the film, everything, that this is an unusual move, but a really interesting one, because she does come across quite serious. She does come across as a thinker. She's a strategist. She gets involved in a rebellion.
Yeah.
And I'm like, she's gonna bring the place down and end up in charge. She's going to depose Commodus and rule by herself. And I was like, go girl. And I was like, I want to see that version of the film play out.
Same. Yes.
they hinted at that same thing in Gladiator too, that like Marcus Aurelius says something like, if only you were born a man, as if like her character could have actually been a very legitimate leader of Rome, if not for her sex. And you're like,
it's just got to come back to the fact that Lucilla is documented as, you know, obviously rebelling against Commodus, and obviously the part that the films always lead out is that she was caught and executed.
yeah.
But I think it just comes down to that idea that she was somehow opposed to Commodus, and therefore we can make this into like a philosophical difference, as opposed to what it potentially was, which was that she maybe just didn't like something that he had done on a personal level. Like she didn't like the husband that she had been given and thought that he was beneath her or something like that, which, yeah, is maybe part of why she rebelled. But yeah, I think it's just that idea of, well, she rebelled. Why? What was her point of difference? And therefore, let's make it a philosophical difference. Let's make it something that's quite political. I like the fact that, I have to say, I do like the fact that Lucilla's costuming is incredibly modest for a sword and sandal film. I'm not saying it's perfect. I do love the big Sophia Loren eyeliner moments and the 60s coif that she is sporting relentlessly. But I was actually, when I looked back, I was like, oh God, this is actually like really, really modest and not at all the sort of diaphanous drapery, apart from one scene when she's asleep, which I presume is meant to be like her pajamas or something. But
Naturally.
yeah.
That scene is really about the floor mosaic, though.
Oh, the floor mosaic.
Yeah.
Can we talk about the floor mosaic?
There's a lot of great mosaic work in this film. So we can add that category.
Well, so weirdly, when I was watching it, so we do this thing on Twitter where we do Mosaic Mondays. And when I was watching one of the palace scenes, I literally saw the mosaic that we had tweeted on Monday in the background. I was like, oh my God.
Yeah, no, they did such a good job. And I really enjoyed like being able to point and be like, I know that, or I've seen that, or like those look so familiar, or I bet that's real. Or so, yeah, that was really, really fun, actually.
And back to sort of Sophia Loren, where we were only, I think, 1 year out, maybe less, from Elizabeth Taylor as Cleopatra, right? Which is what exactly you were describing.
Yeah.
The kind of sexualized exoticism. And
that's kind of interesting, too, because, I mean, so many of heroine figures in the past have had this modest, almost virginal aspect to them. It's interesting, like, she still has a love interest, but that's like they never have a one night together. They just sneak kisses all the time. And like that has to be an aspect of her for her to actually be considered a good leader, as much as they're going to kind of portray her as a leader. Because the one other film I remembered is the one that we watched forever ago, Jason and the Argonauts with Andromache. And like Andromache goes on like this, I think she's going to do something cool because she's going with Jason to go do something. Or is it Jason? I'm lost now. Who is it?
No, are you thinking of the old Clash of the Titans?
Clash of the Titans. You're thinking of Andromeda, which she goes along with the adventure, but only for a little bit.
Is it Perseus?
I think if it's Clash of the Titans, then it's Perseus.
Okay. But Andromache goes on the adventure, but then she ends up doing nothing and she's told to ride back to her hometown. And I'm like, you could have done so much with her and you didn't. And like that, I felt like almost the same with, like, they were giving her credit for so much, but you never really got to see her do anything.
Well, and then she still has to get rescued by Stephen Boyd in the tent later, right? Where her treacherous husband has arranged for her assassination.
But this is where we kind of have to pick a lane a little bit, because I agree. Like, I'm all for Scylla in these movies. She's a really interesting character in both movies. And obviously, yes, I am on board for watching a film where she actually does, seize power and overthrow communists and that kind of stuff. But we can't sit here and nitpick the historical accuracy of this film and then say we want a female emperor of Rome at this point.
Oh, come on.
Yeah.
Come on.
Hey, we sure can. We can alternate reality this Roman Empire.
Well, you can. That's what I mean, that you can, but then it kind of takes away your credibility when you're like, but is this really exactly how Marcus Aurelius was? I don't think so. Like,
I don't think people could handle a film where they got to see Marcus Aurelius as he really was. He is so much more complicated and interesting than I think he's given credit for in the general sort of understanding. It'd be great to do like a limited series, I think, on
sure.
But
That's what I mean. That's great. But that's going down the historical accuracy path. This is my point.
Proper HBO money spent.
But this is my point. You can't be like, let's have Marcus Aurelius as he really was, guys. Come on, Hollywood, lift your game, and then be like, but also give us this fantasy where a woman becomes emperor.
You're asking me to be consistent, and I'm never going to be able to give you that.
This is a historian thing, and it really irritates me. Because as someone who's a film historian, it really irritates me when people are like all these critiques, this is a crap movie, but fan fiction, I want this to happen.
Very true.
Fair enough.
Let's get Palmyra then. Palmyra was cool and is fitting both needs as far as I'm concerned, of like badass woman, still technically lost, but she was involved in the action and she's not killed at the end. So you got Roman men being like, yeah, there's a woman holding power while like we can't even keep an emperor. We've had like 10 so far in the time that she's been doing stuff.
Yes.
Yeah.
We've mentioned this before, and other guests have brought it up, of actually just a sort of a tendency. We talked about like when films tend to be about Roman history, we tend to keep going back to the same wells, right? We tend to keep going back to Caesar. I mean, to a lesser extent, Marcus Aurelius. I'm not sure actually how many film depictions of Marcus Aurelius there are. We know at least 2. I assume more. And with women, it's, I think, a particular problem because we keep coming back to Cleopatra in particular when, kind of like Christy was mentioning, there's more out there in the world. But and then it just keeps coming back to like, no, we're going to do Cleopatra. And then I'm doing air quotes right this time, which is a whole other, box of worms that I didn't mean to open just now, but, cat's out of the bag.
Yeah. Gal Gadot, if you're listening, now's your chance.
Oh, I'm pretty sure she listens to this.
She 100% does. She wants to get Cleopatra right. So, yeah.
We are on the cusp, though, of an anti-capitalist revolution in this conversation, though, because how do you change a system which is predicated on the success of other things in the system? Like, part of what Gladiator is able to do is to build on this film and to build on this whole culture of sword and sandals, which was out of favor, and bring it back in a slightly different way for a new audience. And people are interested in the stories that they know something about. So I think it really behooves us as people who are interested in the ancient world and who study it to talk about it in public as much as possible in order for news stories to become part of what enters into greater public consciousness, because then people get inspired and they want to do the things. And I would love to see all of those films. I'm like, there are so many incredible stories out of Roman history. And that's just one culture. You know, that's not even counting the rest of the Mediterranean or the rest of the world. And it's like, there are incredible stories everywhere.
And to the point, there does seem to be at least an audience or a market for that, because I'm just thinking with the success of Women King, which was kind of building on a sort of a relatively unknown, you know, it's not European history or medieval history or Roman history or anything like that, and it did gangbusters. But yeah, like there is sort of a demand, at least it feels like, because you know, Hollywood tends to be a very sort of risk averse business model for obvious reasons, right? I mean, and when a movie bombs like this one did, it can bankrupt people. And,
well, this is the thing. This film didn't bomb. And this is the thing, like, I have to say, this is a big myth about this film. It didn't bomb. It's just that it cost so much to make that it became unwieldy. I mean, again, it's a bit of a metaphor for the Empire itself. But in order to make an epic like this, it became so prohibitively expensive that it became very hard for these films to make enough money to justify continuing to make them. It's the same with Cleopatra. They are both blamed for ending the epic era. And yes, there is a truth that I think that audiences were kind of like maybe done with these sorts of movies. Maybe they weren't as keen to see them anymore. They wanted like a new style. And we can obviously see that we've got the collapse of the studio system coming afterwards. We see a really big shift in terms of the types of movies that are getting made by the end of the 60s because the studio system has collapsed and censorship is changing and all of that kind of stuff. So it's a different world. We're at the beginning of the 60s, obviously. But it is a big myth about this film and Cleopatra that they did poorly at the box office. They didn't. They actually made huge amounts of money. It's just that they also cost huge amounts of money. And that's partly because of various things that happened that were beyond anyone's control. So Cleopatra, the cost spiraled out of hand because Elizabeth Taylor got so sick and had to have a tracheotomy. And they then had to move the set and rebuild it entirely from Pinewood to Cinecittà. Like, it's because of those sorts of costs that were completely unforeseen. And then the fact that she got to, like, I mean, God, her contract, they had signed onto this contract thinking that they were going to make it in this period, and it ended up taking them, so long to make that paying for her household, her servants, all that kind of stuff, the cost just became astronomical. But it did actually make money. And there were films made about the ancient world after Fall of the Roman Empire. In fact, a funny thing happened on the way to the forum was made on the sets of the Fall of the Roman Empire after that film, obviously. They just dirtied it up. So they were still making films about the ancient world. It's just that these sorts of very, as you say, golden era ones, yes, they'd had their day. But it wasn't, I don't think, because the films itself were so poorly received.
That's so interesting, because that was one of the questions I sort of had that I want to talk about, is the myth that this film did really poorly, or at least was received really poorly. And I feel like I read something about Stephen Boyd saying that he credits it as part of why he didn't get more jobs in the future, or why he didn't do more with his career. And I find that really, really surprising, just because of the amount of time and effort that went into this movie. And just in comparison to the other Sword and Sandals that we've watched from this era, I think this one feels like it was doing a really great job for that time.
I think it was lacking some of the elements that people might have expected to see in an epic. I mean, part of the whole point of why Anthony Mann made this film is that he wanted a film that was about Rome, but wasn't about Christianity and Rome.
Which
Okay.
I was going to say, that seems to be another big elephant in the room, even if you're thinking Gibbons very points the finger at Christians as being instrumental in the fall. But yeah, we've talked about a lot of the, like, Ben-Hur and Quo Vadis have a very strong Christian narrative throughout, and this one is that's completely absent in this film.
And that's what Anthony Mann wanted to do. He also wanted to make a film where, I think a lot of people are actually involved in this, wanted to make a film where you actually got to see the good side of Rome a little bit. Like, it's not like, I was reading an article, which it's totally true. When you look at the way that it's shot, a lot of the palace scenes and stuff that you see with Commodus are very brightly lit, and you're a bit like, whoa, the marble, the mosaics, they're blinding me. But if you compare it to, say, Gladiator, which is so dark, it's like the inside of Commodus's mind inside one of those palaces. And so they wanted to show a film which showed that, look, this is why Rome was worth saving, in a sense. Like, these are the good things about Rome. It's not this place where everybody's having the most twisted, messed up sex you can possibly imagine. Everyone's really brutally violent. Everyone's a sadist. They're all Marquis de Sade's in there. They wanted to make a film where it was at least acknowledging that there was this other side to Rome.
It's about chats in the Senate House.
Yeah,
having a good wrestle with your gladiator teacher / boss.
Yeah, exactly. They wanted to have that. They wanted to have that. But I think I don't think Fall of the Roman Empire, like, I'm not saying it was like a smash hit and like everybody at the time thought it was completely unproblematic as a film. I think everybody acknowledged it had shortcomings as a film, but it still attracted an audience and it still made a lot of money is the thing. And that often gets overlooked, I think. And everyone just thinks that it like didn't get seen by anyone.
Did any of you happen to watch, because I watched this on Prime Video, but I watched the preview that was made for it first. Did any of you watch that at all?
I think I did recently. No.
It's pretty hilarious, and I do recommend it.
I did watch a
because it has
trailer
lines
for
like,
it. Yeah, where it's kind of like, this is the most epic thing you're ever going to see. Not just one star actor or two, but 9.
9. My favorite was not just 2 or 3 emotions, all the emotions. And I'm like, what? Is that like the original All the Feels? But like,
but that's not uncommon. Like, this is the thing, though. I don't think that would stand out, because if you look at any ads for movies of this time, they are like that. I mean, my favorite ancient historical preview, which I show to my classes sometimes because when we're studying like early Rome and that kind of stuff, is the Rape of the Sabines. So it does that thing where, it like spins, the title spins out at you, and about like 5 times in 1 minute, it goes, you won't want to miss it. The Rape of the Sabines. It's the film of the century. The Rape of the Sabines. And it's just like, whoa.
Oh my God.
So yeah, trailers of that time are just a different world. Yeah.
Yeah. But that's like the model that like it kept being like, we need to go bigger, more bigger sets, more extras, crazier costumes. And that was just becoming untenable as a model, and the whole thing was falling apart.
Well, look, I mean, that chariot race, I mean, I loved it. I thought it was, I mean, it did the epic things that the trailer suggested it was going to. And I was like, this is all over the shop. It's
the
madness.
Cast. Yeah, the cast. I mean, Omar Sharif, Christopher Plummer, Alec Guinness, Sophia Loren, like, got so many big names in this movie.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's like a model of like the solution is to go bigger and bigger. It's they're going to pull back, and then I don't know, maybe it's like Avatar or something, where it's like, if we make the most expensive movie ever known to man and God, then we will. Maybe had James Cameron directed this movie, it might have turned out different. But
well, that's exactly the point, though. If you put it in the context of filmmaking, you can see, obviously, with Cleopatra and Fall of the Roman Empire, that the cost of making these films and all of that kind of stuff was getting out of hand in terms of what they could expect back in box office. And then if you look at the kinds of films that they're making by the later 60s, we are talking about like those gritty, really issue-driven films with like tiny casts, like, Midnight Cowboy and that kind of stuff. Like, it is it's hard to believe that those films are like, 5 years apart. We're 8 years off The Godfather. It's
right. Yeah.
It is that era of filmmaking where everything's about to shift because of the collapse of the studio system and the change in what people want to see, and also the end of that really strict era of censorship. You have to put it in that bigger context.
Yeah. And it's just not shifting, I guess, but complicating like morals or something that I'm just thinking the United States as like Vietnam or something like that, where like that's going to, usher in a whole era of film that's, like you said, sort of gritty and gets into the ugliness and is introspective in a way, which is kind of I think I've said this on the show before, but my sort of hot take is that Gladiator is not the beginning of a new era of sword and sandal. It's the end of the first era, because it's really kind of the last sort of sword and sandal. And like, yes, it inspires a bunch of sort of copycats for the next decade or so, but like, it is very much of a piece with movies like this. Thematically, structurally, narratively.
Well, that's exactly it. I think it's like anything with history. We like to read backwards, obviously, to get things to make sense and sound really cool. And it sounds really cool to say, oh, the fall of the Roman Empire was about Aurelius and Commodus, and that was the film that killed the epic genre. And then exactly the same storyline brought them back in 2000. Hilarious.
Yeah.
Whereas you're ignoring the messiness of the fact that, no, there are a few more of these sorts of historical films that happen afterwards. Not saying that they were runaway successes, like A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, I don't think was anything to write home about. But yeah, they are still, like, they're still there. And
but then when you get into like Monty Python, right, and that's what, mid-70s, and they're like, by that point they're kind of making fun of the genre, and it's sort of, you know, like all like the way the Roman soldiers are dressed and the sets and the costumes, like it feels, you know, I guess it was maybe a decade out. I'm trying to think if there's like a modern comparison.
I was thinking of Marvel, like the Marvel universe, but now that Disney Plus is putting out those smaller shows, so like She-Hulk is going more like a very different, like they're playing with different genres now and putting superheroes in it, because like Marvel is exhausting at this point to kind of keep up
and
with.
Also the streamingness we might be looking at some kind of collapse in sort of streaming, you know, maybe that's analogous to Houston, because I know at least with Disney Plus that's a huge money suck, I'm pretty sure for the company. And so I don't know, but then again, you know, Ant-Man's coming out and is probably going to make like $2 billion or something, so what do I know?
Well, isn't Netflix like they'll greenlight one season of a show, right? But if it doesn't make a certain amount of money, they're just like, oh, we're just going to cancel it, and it doesn't matter. And we'll
part of it is
it
I have
into
no
something
idea
else.
what exactly makes a show profitable. Like, I don't know. I'm just thinking like my Netflix subscription stays the same no matter if I watch 5,000 hours or 5 hours of Netflix in a month. So like,
but they know what you're watching. That's the whole thing about this. Like, we suggest that you watch this. They know your watch history, so they know what you're watching when you're on it. And that's what they're using. But the problem with these sorts of streaming services, I feel like, is I don't know if that data is actually that readily available. Like, I feel like it's maybe not.
No, there's all sorts of weird, the way Netflix like reports viewing is kind of a weird metric that it's been explained to me, and it has to do with like length of viewer, like a person sitting down and watching, and they have some kind of metric for that I'm sure I could look up and sitting on my computer, but I'm not.
No, but it's like podcasting though. I mean, the data around podcasting is notoriously shady and unreliable. It's really hard to get a good idea, but technically you can see who is listening to your show, whether they're listening all the way to the end or whether they're just listening to half of it, and that kind of thing. I mean, it's creepy how much we can track what people are doing, but I feel like
and then I know what jeans to sell them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I feel like it's a bit like that. And certainly that's how they like push their new content towards you. And
how did we get here?
The history of film.
Guys, I prepped to talk about the fall of the Roman Empire, and I'm not ready for this topic at
fall
all.
of the Roman Empire, my Netflix subscription.
Or the fall of the Disney Empire, right? How does a streaming service collapse? Is it from without or from within?
They've got theme parks and toys. Disney's going to be fine. I've got a question. So we've been dancing around Commodus as a character, and we've commented a few times, but I really wanted to bring that back, especially to this trope of Marcus Aurelius's death being the reason that Commodus gets to become emperor. And I think the one thing that both films don't acknowledge is like he's 18 or so, like he's a teenager when he becomes an empire. So maybe it's fair for Marcus Aurelius to be like, I don't know, you might not be ready for this. Seems reasonable.
It does seem reasonable, but the thing is that Commodus had been heavily involved with Aurelius's reign for years by the time Aurelius dies. Even though, he's a teenager, so what is he going to do? But he is heavily associated with Aurelius in, like, what is it, the last 8-10 years of his reign?
Something like that. Yeah. They're co-emperor for about a decade, I think.
The writing is on the wall, people. Like, it's going to happen.
Like, this guy is coming. Yeah, it's a bit like, how do you train somebody who you know is going to have to take on this job? And it's like, I don't know. Everybody seemed to be like, oh, well, I don't know if he's up for it, but maybe it'll be all right. And the historical record seems pretty clear on the fact that, you know, he's nominated outright as heir about 4 years before Marcus Aurelius dies. So everybody knows this is coming. And it's weird that this is a kind of an odd tension that this film creates, and also then Gladiator replicates slightly to suggest that, you know, that these questions maybe have led Marcus Aurelius down a different path. And it's like, publicly, that does not seem to have been the case in the historical record.
No, and I kind of wonder if it's a source thing where everyone wants to remember Marcus Aurelius as a good guy and an amazing ruler, and therefore he can't possibly have given us this psychopath that's going to rename the city after himself.
He wouldn't have made a mistake like that, would he?
Yeah, so I kind of feel like it's a rewriting of Marcus Aurelius to save him from being tainted by Commodus.
To create a neat kind of narrative, right? That it's like we had good emperors, and then there was a bad emperor, and that's why everything kind of went to shit.
Yeah, but you can totally blame Marcus Aurelius for that. You really can.
Back to the like sort of like the graduate student question that you might get on like a comprehensive exam, like when was the fall of Rome inevitable? Or I think we literally had a question when Eli and I took our comm exams that was like, when was the fall of the Republic inevitable? And part of me wants the facetious answer, which is the minute Rome is founded, it is inevitably going to end. So
I'd go with that answer, and I would definitely build the evidence base from there, because you're not wrong.
but also part of me starts to think of like, we tend to do, or like film and culture and reception of ancient history, in my view, tends to do a lot of kind of compressing, where we have a whole sort of slew of images and iconography and ideas and motifs that we associate with Rome, and they tend to get very kind of compressed. And sometimes this happens like literally, where you'll get a scene and you've got art and architecture from like 6 centuries worth of history kind of all crammed into one scene, because it's recognizably Roman. It's recognizably Roman or Greek or Egyptian or whatever. But also like this happens, I think, in like narrative beats where, Commodus also, he feels a little bit like Nero and a little bit like Caligula, or at least like the ideas of the idea of the bad emperor. And you see this, and even I'm thinking in like Mel Brooks' History of the World, where, Nero's like lounging, munching on grapes. And like, the idea of corrupt Roman emperor becomes a sort of character in and of itself that's informed piecemeal by real historical people and sources and things like that. But it becomes a sort of character in and of itself that these actors are inhabiting, whether it's Peter Ustinov or Christopher Plummer here.
I would say Tacitus is to blame for that. I think they had a trope of the bad emperor well before Hollywood existed. If you read, obviously, like, the Annals, and you look at Caligula, not that there's much on Caligula in that, but if you look at the way that Caligula is represented in sources like Suetonius, and if you look at Nero, like, it is almost like they're ticking off little tropes of like a tyrant, And
then like they start good, then they turn. There's a turn always, and like the kinds of things that they indulge in, whether it's
acting,
gluttony,
music playing, gladiators.
Exactly. So I feel like Hollywood is actually picking up on something that the Romans themselves actually would recognize.
I also wonder if it's just a reaction of like Americans being like, see what happens when you go monarchy? It never turns out well.
I mean, I'm wondering if we're in Gladiator 2, we're going to get a sort of pastiche of like a Trumpian figure or something like that. It seems a very easy comparison to draw.
Well, yeah, and I feel like ancient historians, for better or worse, have been trying to find like an ancient analog for modern political figures, like all over the place, right?
Yeah.
And, we're sort of shoving things and ticking boxes about how we want to view Trump or whoever. And it's kind of fun to have that as a character, because I think it's so familiar and we really recognize that. The
we respond
mad
to narratives,
emperor. And I think it's so weird when we try to make it real political figures, because I think probably I would argue with Tacitus about this, but like the complexity of the human person is so much more than
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, and we're talking about like the problem, the reluctance, like having a bad emperor is an easier way to explain away, when really the problem might be with the system that's has been set up. And I think this is true for Rome. Like the way the Roman Republic apparatus was sort of set up really does sort of feel like it's inevitable that eventually one guy is going to say like, maybe I should just run everything.
Well, and the same could be said for like modern American politics. Is like the system is part of the problem.
Yes.
Yeah. That's where I think Gladiator has a more successful narrative, in the sense of like hooking you in. Not saying it doesn't have its own problems and that kind of stuff, but I think that they recognize that Fall of the Roman Empire, when it didn't have the whole Romans versus Christians narrative that was very easy to latch onto, it became maybe a little bit too thinky, perhaps, or a little unclear, especially for something that's so long. Whereas in Gladiator, they replaced that dichotomy with Republic versus Empire. And that, I think, is something that really plays into, as you say, the American vision of its of its own politics that, you know,
Absolutely.
we're a republic and republics are great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So great.
No
Yeah.
problems there.
Yeah.
No problems at all. Yeah.
Oh, that's a terrible note to end on.
No, I'm about to bring up a different point. I'm going to go
Good.
off. Yeah, I'm taking us on a segue. So we've mentioned like the absence of the Christianity, but what we haven't mentioned is the real input of the paganism, because that is something that this film is really doing. And there was this moment where I noticed the giant hand sculpture. And I was like,
You noticed that?
I was like,
Which Commodus emerges from?
yeah, but you see it before that happens. And I was like, are they playing to like, you know, the idea of the colossal statue where they've only got a hand left? And I was like,
That's
guys,
what-
you would
Yeah.
have the full colossal statue. It's okay. And then it emerged that it was like, you know, the hand that opens and reveals Commodus. Maybe in an Ephesian Artemis-esque kind of cult, because there's prior to that, you've got some people flagellating themselves.
Well, isn't it meant to be the cult of Sabazius? Isn't it that what it's linked to?
Maybe it is.
I think it is. It is the
I
cult
mean,
of Sabazius.
and like
Yeah.
the iconography for me, I was like, oh.
No, it's actually that's actually a cultic symbol associated with Sabazius.
Oh,
Yeah.
phew.
Yeah, but not something that is logical for Commodus to be associated with.
Mhm.
I was reading an article that said, yeah, it would have made it a little bit more sense if it was like ISIS, because apparently Commodus was super into that. I can totally see that for him. But yeah, I don't think there's any documented evidence that he was like crazy about this particular cult. So that's what it's
okay.
referencing.
Because I was like, wow, this is because it's gone the opposite direction. Because you kind of get used to the Christian didactism of these Hollywood epics of this period, and this one doesn't have it, and it also leans right into the paganism. And the other really key moment that I loved and definitely forced the attention onto it is the moment where Commodus recarves the sculpture of Jupiter in the temple to be his own face. And he's like, wow, it's happened, guys. I'm definitely the top dog around here. Jupiter.
But that's
and
a
me.
reference.
See the similarities?
Yeah. Didn't he recast the statue that Nero had originally built next to the Colosseum in his own face? And he gave it the name the Colossus, which is where we get... Isn't that's a reference to that, I think.
I assume, yeah. And I think multiple faces have been taken off, just heads of both like marble. There's some.
That's always one of my
like,
favorite tropes when you see the sculpture and they have like a weirdly tiny head on the big buff body because it's been.
Yeah. Or there's some like fun ones I feel like that we see out of like the Pompeii area where it's like halfway in between. They've like hacked off part of something or like sticking another head back on. And I kind of loved that. I was like, of course. Why wouldn't you do that this way? Of course.
That brings me to the other scene too, where is it Balabar is the leader?
Yeah, and Maimonides, is that the guy's name?
Oh,
yeah,
James
and
Mason. I can't believe I forgot to mention him. Yeah.
He was my favorite. He was.
Yeah.
He was
I liked
so
him.
good. Yeah.
And they're having that conversation of, is it Wotan is the war god? And like, to me, that was really interesting because that's a conversation I've had with my Roman Civ students about in Gladiators, like when they talk about Rome and the Roman people, and this film was doing it a lot too. It's like, we want a frontier of humans, a human frontier. And like, it's really playing this idea. It's like, no, everyone's going to be Roman. And what does that mean exactly? And you see the like pushing down of their own cult statue. And I'm like, I hate this because that is not at all what the Roman Empire was, really.
Maimonides kind of embodies that, and it very much feels like a kind of American dream thing where it's like, I was Greek and now I am Roman, and I have this new identity that
I was
I've
a
sort of
slave
created.
and now I'm free. Yeah.
Exactly. And now I can do that for you and incorporate you into the Roman apparatus, and then you will stop being whatever it is you're being, and you will start being Roman. Which is, it's a form of, like, I guess, global imperialism, right?
Yeah, and I think that's what was frustrating for me, is because that's not the historical reality, but it's very much kind of more propaganda about, the idea of the melting pot. And I'm like, we're all one people. And I remember one of the speeches, I forget who said it, but it's like, no matter the color of your skin, which...
Yeah, Maimonides, I think, says that. Yeah.
And I'm just like, I know what's happening here.
Which, I'm too young and too ingrained in that mid-century American like civil rights discourse, but it very much feels like the kind of discussion about like race and culture and ethnicity that was happening. At least even maybe up even through like the 90s, like when that was sort of at least growing up sort of in the United States, and kind of when we talked about multiculturalism, it very much was that kind of like melting pot ideology, which is a form of erasure, right? Through assimilation.
Once again, a great topic to end on, guys.
I have a better closing. I do have a good closer, unless anyone has anything else we want to say about Fall of the Roman Empire.
I want to say that I liked talking about this movie much more than I liked watching it.
Which is par for the course for you.
It is. Yeah.
But I think that's the thing about this sort of movie. That's why I said it initially. Like, I do dig it because I think it does have a lot of really interesting elements in it. And in a way, I think it did accomplish Anthony Mann's aim, which was to make a thinking man's epic.
Yes.
That is true.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So actually, this leads me to sort of two questions, since I've got Fiona and Peta here who are well versed, is if we were to, now that we've, I think, seen pretty much all of the major 50s, 60s epics, do we have a ranking?
Ooh.
Top three.
Well,
Or
obviously
top three.
Spartacus is number one.
I was going to say Spartacus is the leftist epic.
Also worked on by Anthony Mann, just very briefly.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, look, I don't feel like I've watched as many of these epics as I could. I certainly haven't watched all of them, but I have always loved Cleopatra because it's just so extravagant. And the way that Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton are playing off each other in that film is priceless. And so for me, that is a standout, and I always want to return to that.
Yeah,
and think
I
about
do
it
love
more.
Cleopatra. And look, Ben-Hur, I mean, I sometimes start getting like over it, but then I rewatch it and I'm like, it is well made.
Yeah, there's a lot I don't like about Ben-Hur, like the last hour, but I still come back and I'm like, man, that chariot race is really good.
Yeah, and look, Charlton Heston, for all the fact that in real life I have such a problem with him as a person and his politics and that sort of thing. But there is something about that freaking jawline in a film about the ancient world. It just works.
And he was almost in this movie, but I do have a note in my notes. I wrote down like, man, like this era was really the peak point for chins. A lot of great chins in Hollywood, and Stephen Boyd, great chin.
Yeah.
Christopher Plummer, great chin. Even with that chin strap.
I think that casting plays a big role here, because you look at the difference in masculinities that are being presented to you in this film, with the Stephen Boyd having this very sort of hard-angled masculinity playing the hero, where Christopher Plummer has a softer masculine look to him and is playing the bad guy. And like, there's some subtle messages coming through in that casting as well.
But see, I see him only as a figure of authority, because I will never see him ever as anything other than Captain Von Trapp.
That was exactly what I was thinking. Yes. I was like, I can't unsee the Sound of Music of it all. It's like, I see him tearing a Nazi flag, and that's like it.
Yeah. So even though he's meant to be the bad guy, there is something about me where I'm watching him, I'm just like, I'm remembering my childhood crush on Captain Von Trapp.
Yep.
I mean, but I think like Laurence Olivier in Spartacus is playing into that too, and the way the way that character is coded, and the sort of his like quote unquote softness, or that he's got the sort of softer features. But yeah, there's a lot to unpack in these films, especially about just masculinity.
Yeah.
And wish fulfillment and all that. Chris, do you have a top or a rank?
I think Spartacus is still up there. I don't even think I said it at the beginning, but it's like I did kind of dig this for like the films that come out during this time, because it's one of those films that I like thinking about when films are being produced and what is kind of happening in the world. And like that one was really reflective of that. And the fact it had such a big impact on Gladiator, and thinking about the changes Gladiator made at the time it was produced to the story was like...
Almost like they got a trial run.
Yeah, it was like an interesting thought process game. But again, it's like I won't be watching it again anytime soon, but I enjoyed it for what it was.
So my other closing question, unless anyone wants to add in more 2 cents, is we are sort of, as we were recording this in early mid-February 2023, recently it has been announced that we are getting a sequel to Gladiator. So I also wanted to get people's opinions, and I can edit it out if we're tired about talking about Gladiator. We can cut it. But I wanted to see if anyone had any strong predictions or hopes for Gladiator 2. Gladiator, we'll call it. Too glad, too ater.
And maybe we should posit that they have plans to cast Lucius. I think they have. So
Yes,
we know he is supposed to be the protagonist, or at least heavily involved in the story.
And actually, I will add, I'm a little bit bummed that they didn't go the Alien route and just made the sequel Gladiators. Which is maybe my favorite Hollywood story ever, like the pitch meeting for Aliens.
Aliens.
No, literally. So the whole pitch meeting for Aliens was James Cameron goes into a board meeting and he writes alien on the board, and then he writes an S, and then he turns the S into a $sign, and that's the entire pitch. And
James Cameron.
right. So I don't know. Yeah, thoughts or hopes for Gladiators.
Well, in a way, I think we might actually get what we all want, which is we might get Lucilla being a major character in this film. I definitely think that no matter where the storyline goes, I think that for a film of this era, I think there will be a major female character, whether that's a gladiator character, and they do the whole, female gladiatrix kind of thing, or whether it is Lucilla herself or someone like that. I mean, we know that Lucilla had a daughter as well who was caught up in the plot that she was executed for. So whether it's that, I don't know. But I kind of think that this might be the film that we wanted to see originally.
The fan fiction film of sorts, yeah. Because it's in such a bad place at the end. Like, it ends fine if you want to just leave it open-ended, but now it's now we have the Year of 5 Emperors and people are alive who should not be alive. What do you do with them?
Yeah, and with Maximus and Commodus both being dead, it is a bit
It's
where do we take this? Yeah.
What?
My dream is that Gladiators, the sequel, will be a new sort of casting gem for an unsung up-and-coming Australian/New Zealand actor to really make their break. We clearly bring something to the table in films of this nature. That's why Gladiator did so well, clearly. And you have to...
And Troy, Eric Bana. I mean,
Yep.
I cannot argue with that.
And look, Eric Bana, it's a whole different story because we grew up with him being a comedian.
Yeah.
We knew him.
Yeah.
And everyone in Australia knows that guy. And we couldn't navigate the transition from him being a hilarious dude to being a leading buff man.
Yeah,
and I
he was on, if you don't know,
so
you need to look it up. Yeah, he was it Full Frontal?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there was a sketch show in Australia, which was very big when we were growing up, called Full Frontal. And Eric Bana was most famous, I think, for taking off this particular journalist in Australia called Ray Martin, who had a real helmet, black helmet hair, like a Lego man. And so Eric Bana used to put on a Lego man hair and pretend to be this guy called Ray Martin. So if you have never seen Eric Bana's early comedic rigs, he did that for 10, 15 years.
He was a very funny man. His other famous character was a guy with a really severe mullet called Peta.
Yeah, that's right. Peta.
And these things are joyous aspects of our
which is Australian for Peter. So sorry, I could just see you looking blank. What is that name?
What? Who now?
Yeah.
Peta.
Yeah.
So the moment that Troy happened,
we were like, what?
Greek
tragedy.
we were there, and we were like, Brad Pitt, and then we were like, Eric Bana. What? And it's we love him. We love him.
We do.
So clearly the Australian lead role casting is very important for the success of a sequel.
That's why Alexander did not do as well. There wasn't
that was a poor choice.
Irish.
Yeah. The Irish are not the same.
You can't put an Irishman in to do an Australian's job. No. You cannot.
or someone who was born a Kiwi, but Australia has claimed for their own, a la Russell Crowe. Yeah.
A Kiwi will not tolerate any Carl Urbans or anything like that.
Oh, Carl Urban is beautiful. No, I'll take him.
And we obviously need, Taika Waititi to direct.
Yeah,
Naturally.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. The Thunder from Down Under. Yeah.
I'm just imagining him being involved in a Gladiator project. I'm like, Oh no, that would be
I mean,
very interesting.
if you saw Our Flag Means Death, I think he can approach the historical
He
topic.
can. Our Flag
It was
Means
more
Death
of
is
just
wonderful.
him paired with Ridley Scott. I don't know how does like what comes out of that.
Yeah.
Well, I think in a way, I think it could be again one of those films that's maybe a bit confronting to watch, but to talk about is interesting because I just recently watched Love and Thunder, the latest Thor that he was involved in, and whew, my God, they really gave him like I think creative license on that film, but. It's actually it's so clever, but it's almost too clever. There's like too many jokes, too many references all happening at once. But the level of research, I'm like, props. So yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, this is the gladiators that I want to see.
All right. In that case, I think we're gonna call it. That's a great line to end on. Dr. Rad, Dr. G, thank you so much for coming on the show. We loved having you. Coordinating the time was, well, I mean, it actually wasn't that hard, but I made it hard. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on. We hope you enjoyed talking about this classic gem.
Oh, no, thank you so much for having us. Clearly, there's nothing I love more than ranting about historical films.
Well, you've come to the right place.
Yes.
If listeners want to find, read, listen, hear more from you, where can they do that?
Ooh, they can do that in lots of places. So our podcast is called The Partial Historians. You can find it anywhere you listen to good podcasts. You can also find us on social media. We're in all the usual places. And we do have a book coming out very soon. Yeah, we're very excited. It's on the Roman kings. If you thought Roman emperors were insane, just you wait.
They're pretty cool. Well, we're going through an independent publisher, so if you want to find a copy of our book, you need to check out Highlands Press website. I'm not sure when this episode will be released. At the moment, it's available for pre-order, but it will be actually with you in a physical copy shortly. And we are also working on a digital copy for those of you who maybe the postage isn't your thing. So that will hopefully be coming to you at some point this year.
We'll send a link.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I'd also like to give a shout out to the book that I drew a lot on for preparing for this episode, which is the Martin Winkler edited volume on the fall of the Roman Empire.
I was reading the BMCR of that just before we started. Excellent.
Yeah.
Again, thank you so much. And hopefully we'll have you back on the show soon. Bye, everybody.
Bye.